evening, and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we are coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the airways of WNYE 91.5 FM. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature and Director of the National Black Writers Conference. And Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from all over the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. What you heard in the background opening up for us was Gary Bartz's I've Known Rivers, and that's a takeoff of Langston Hughes's poems. And I want to also thank my engineer, Fritz Richardson, for always being here and keeping us on point. So we're going to begin. I'm very excited to have on the telephone with me this evening Regina Mason. And Regina Mason is the editor of The Life of William Grimes, The Runaway Slave. She has edited it along with William Andrews, and it is a fascinating book, well researched. It's also very unique in its traditions. You're going to hear all about that and why this is such an important work during this time. So, Regina, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. A pleasure to be here.
You're welcome, and thank you for reaching out to us and sharing with us this important work that you've done. So tell us about William Grimes, The Runaway Slave, and what prompted you to devote this important research.
Certainly. William Grimes is, let me put this out here first, he is my great-great-great grandfather. That as I began this research, I didn't know that we were related at all. I had a little story, a clue from a family history that told me maybe, he was the Grimes my aunt had given me many years ago. I then would piece it all together and find out that this gentleman was quite pioneering, yet nobody knows about him. He's author of the first fugitive slave narrative in American history. His story is very compelling. Some historians say that he even inaugurated this whole new genre of American literature, which would be the slave narrative. But yet his voice has been lost to time. His is a very bitter pill to swallow. He is caught in the North after having spent 9 years quasi-free. His master then finds him and demands that he either pay for his freedom or be taken back into slavery. And by this time, he's married. He has accumulated property. He has children. So he's not thinking about returning to that lifestyle of a slave, even though the North wasn't that much better for him. His soul just shuddered at the thought. So he ends up giving up his property, his home, his livelihood, to pay for freedom that was really never fully recognized.
Right. Well, you raise a number of issues, and I purposefully did not want to initially share with the audience that he was your great grandfather, because that's part of also what helped to prompt you to continue this research. And but tell us a little bit, before we go more into the story, tell us a little bit about Regina Mason.
Okay, I am not what you would call a writer, but yet I was compelled to tell this story. I'm just what I call an average person. I don't have a college degree. I never finished. But this whole search and process of writing this narrative or editing this narrative has been my education. This man, this unlettered slave, taught me so much about life and achievement and excelling and so forth. So he helped me to get a bigger vision for myself, which was remarkable because his story lay dormant for almost 200 years. I am retired. I retired early from the University of California at Berkeley after 17 years of service. I'm now doing what I love to do, and that is writing and telling the Grimes story. And I've got a nonprofit underway as well, and a documentary on William Grimes.
Right. So you have become a documentarian yourself, which is why I wanted you to share with our listening audience because of being compelled to do this research. You have ended up becoming a documentarian and a writer.
Yes.
So, yeah, so let's go back into the story. You also edited this book with William Andrews. So share with us what the research process was like, how long it took you, quite a number of years, and how did you bring William Andrews on to help you come up with this new edited edition?
Okay, well, let me start with telling you about the process. It began as a simple genealogy project involving family records like vital statistics, U.S. Census returns, military records, and whatnot. And I researched in places like the Family History Center, at the Mormon Temple, and state genealogical libraries in my area, as well as branch offices of the National Archives. And then over time, it grew into university collections such as rare newspapers, land deeds, slave inventories, special collections, and whatnot. I was there compiling this information as I was working at the University of Berkeley. So the libraries, the repositories, they were just huge. They really aided my search. And as I was collecting this information, I also devoured books on American slavery, the history of the U.S., and also national matters that impacted the lives of my ancestor. All of this married together allowed me to understand the stories of my ancestors more thoroughly.
Right. So it's really important that you also have that context, that you were not only doing that research, but you were studying the context, the history, the political areas, all of the work that was being done in literature at that time.
Exactly, the understanding the laws that impacted the movement of my people. There's no better way to get involved in understanding America's history than utilizing the lens of your family.
Yes.
It will make history come alive in ways you've never, ever dreamed. And so I'm sucked into all this. I mean, it becomes a passion, and it becomes just something that I am stuck doing every day. I mean, it consumes me. And yet I'm working, I'm raising a family and all that. But this was something I kind of felt like Grimes was sort of guiding me as if he wanted to be found. But anyway, that's another story. But you did ask about Dr. William Andrews'
Yes.
involvement. He was the only living scholar at the time that wrote about William Grimes. And he, in his book, To Tell a Free Story, he may have had a couple pages on William Grimes. And that was it.
Right.
Charles Nichols, a professor from the South, also wrote about William Grimes, but that was in, I believe, the early 50s, if I'm not mistaken, but he had passed away. So the only person that I could talk to about William Grimes was Bill Andrews. And so I sought him out, and I told him what I was doing. I shared bits of information with him, and he was always very encouraging, and even amazed at the steps or lengths I had taken this narrative.
Right. You helped to make his own research and his story much more, a much richer experience.
Exactly. We definitely aided and learned from each other. Bill was a wonderful mentor to me, and he kind of took me under his wing after a while. It didn't happen in the beginning. I wasn't sure that he took me seriously in the beginning.
That's right. You weren't the traditional academic scholar.
Exactly. And after I kept pestering him, and not in a way to say, "Hey, let's work together," but I would sort of tease him with the information that I'd found. For instance, I found a series of letters that negotiated William Grimes' freedom. And I felt like, my God, something needs to be done with all of this information. This man's story was much more than the narrative that he wrote. It was much more than the 3 pages that Bill Andrews devoted to him. And so finally I told him what I had in these letters. And he wrote me back. He said, you really ought to publish this work. And I didn't know how to go about doing it. And he told me that he could assist. And we talked back and forth. And then we agreed that this should be a partnership. And we approached Oxford University Press, and they bought into it, and the rest is history. And my book was published, or this new edition of the Grimes narrative was published in 2008. Since then, more information has come out about William Grimes. Before I was in the dusty archives digging up all this information. Now we have information on demand with the internet and all documents being digital at this point. And so it's been incredible. I tell people all the time, if you want to get into your family history or you want to research someone, now is the best time to do it, because it's a much easier journey, much easier road than when I began in the,
Yes,
in
it
the
certainly
90s.
is. Now, one of the interesting things, and I had to, as I was reading it, I had to put it down, although it's not a very thick book. It's just very different than the traditional slave narratives that we have, and it was just so powerful, it's so strong, and disturbing. So what makes this the story of William Grimes unique among the tradition of slave narratives?
Okay, well, first of all, he was the pioneer in that his story predates any abolitionist movement involvement, and that's huge. He's not writing to a white audience. He's beholden to no one. He's telling his story unfiltered.
Yes.
Okay, now, and that sets him apart from the narratives that followed, that were swept up by the abolitionist movement, because they are writing to a white audience. They have to be careful in how they present and tell their story to a white audience.
Exactly.
And so that is the separating factor there.
And that's exactly why I think it's very important that we really make sure that a wider public knows about this book. Would you like to share one of the excerpts to give our audience a sense of what William Grimes did? And I was curious as to how he himself became educated. I imagine it might have had to do with the fact that he was, of course, mixed, as many enslaved Africans were.
That's partly it. Another reason that he may have been literate is because he was a slave that had mobility. He was sold, of course, had 10 different masters, and some of it was spent on the plantation. He traveled with other slave masters to various places. He was an assistant to them. So there are clues in the narrative about how he picked up the bare bones of reading and writing,
Right.
but we don't know exactly how. That would be a question I would definitely ask him. but I know the time is limited. Should I go right in?
Yes. Why don't you share with us?
Okay. I would advise no slave to leave his master. If he runs away, he is most sure to be taken. If he is not, he will ever be in apprehension of it.
I am
I,
so. I'm sorry.
I have had to work hard and often insulted and cheated. But I hope some will buy my books from charity, although I am no beggar. I am now entirely destitute of property. Where and how I shall live, I don't know. Where and how I shall die, I don't know. But I hope I may be prepared. If it were not for the stripes on my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would, in my will, leave my skin as a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and then bind the Constitution of glorious, happy, and free America. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of American liberty.
Mm, powerful, powerful.
So powerful.
And share what. Why did you choose that? And because it brings up one of the paradoxes that I see in this story. The being a free man versus being a slave.
Exactly. Well, in William Grimes' life, in his world, living in the North, he wasn't entirely free. He was often, like he said, cheated and insulted, having to carve out or etch out a living, and that living always consisted of living in poverty. So the North really wasn't any better off than the South. He had to deal with white privilege in the North. There were many that came from other countries that were uh, vying for the jobs of the quote unquote free black man. So he was always having to fend for a livelihood. The paradox, of course, that brings up the contradiction of American slavery. I mean, he even opens the book with the contradiction by saying, I was born in a land boasting of liberty and equality, yet I was born a slave. So, he just could not reconcile the fact that America was this land of liberty and opportunity, but turned around and denied himself and people of color any sort of opportunity.
Right. And then added to that is he could also pass, right?
Yes, he could. And he described himself in language I had never heard before. He said he was 3 parts white, but passed as a Negro.
Interesting.
That
Interesting.
he was married to a black woman, and that tells me that he was comfortable being black on the one hand, but yet he could not reconcile the fact that here he is, this mulatto slave. His father is this wealthy planter. So he's living between these two worlds.
The double consciousness.
Right. It was just so striking to me. And such a, we look and sometimes we talk about the tragic mulatto or the black or the light skin living between two worlds and so forth. But I think we should really focus on how America perceived what was black and what wasn't. I mean, he's obviously a quote-unquote victim of the one-drop rule, which is pure fabrication. I mean, it neither makes him black or white, but yet there was no scientific evidence that should say that one drop of black blood designated you as a black person. I mean, you're definitely socialized in those conditions, but yet this claim was on the premise of being science.
Right. And they use science. Craig Wilder has a recent book, Ebony and Ivy, where he talks about how racism was used was used to help institutionalize the whole notion of one drop, and how they took science and appropriated concepts of science to justify racism
Yes.
that we have. And I also thought about it because he talks a lot about working at the universities. Part of the work he did in order to survive in the North was to work at places like Harvard in his early days, and
Exactly.
Dartmouth.
And it was very interesting too. He was a barber, or established himself as a barber at the first law school in America, which was the Litchfield School of Law. And in studying his era there as a barber, he saw for the first time white Southerners come north to hone their craft in law. Prior to the Litchfield Law School, men were traveling to Europe to get their law background or degree and so forth. But William Grimes was there when America came together, the North and the South, and debating the issues of slavery and so forth. And I thought that was, what an irony was that for him to be there working, hearing these stories back. He must have heard incredible stories from the mouths of Southerners and Northerners, sort of convened in this classroom setting, and I thought that was remarkable, because it was also there that he would see men from the South that were relatives of people that owned him.
Right.
And here he had stowed away to Connecticut, only to be located by friends of former masters. And I was surprised at how blurred the boundaries were of the North and South. In my research, I found owners of his that were from Connecticut, that were from New England, that went south to become slaveholders.
Right, and that's part of what Wilder does in his book is to talk about how our public universities, our Ivy League universities, were used to educate those who would leave and go to the Caribbean or go to the South and become the plantation owners.
Yes.
And they were often the children of the wealthy plantation owners and those who were really involved in the whole institution of slavery. So there was a lot of back and forth, and people who may have grown up in a more liberal oriented home, once they were educated and were looking for work, would find themselves in the South and owning slaves.
It was so bizarre to me.
It is.
In education,
right.
Really.
Why is it important that this story be told now? Because some would argue that there's too much going on about slavery. We're beyond that. Why do we need to tell the story of the life of William Grimes?
Oh, let me just say this. We hear over and over again the story of George Washington, the story of Thomas Jefferson. We may have had hundreds of authors to write about these individuals. What more can we learn about them? But there's always a new angle, new approach, new insight, So why not William Grimes today? His voice has been dormant for a long time, and he definitely needs to be one of the bookends of the slave narrative genre. We haven't really fully discussed or come to terms with American slavery, which is why 12 Years a Slave is getting a lot of publicity today.
Right.
We have not. The information is out there. Some arguably would say that it's too much, we're inundated. But, this is the first time that Hollywood has done a feature film on slavery that was A true story.
Right, historically accurate.
Historically accurate.
And one can say that if you look at the history of this country, this country has had more years of people being enslaved than not. So you cannot ignore.
Very good
You
point.
cannot ignore. That was actually a point made by Angela Davis in a speech I recently heard her talking about slavery and how we have to talk about it. We can't ignore it.
We have to talk about it, and we have to resurrect these stories, these authentic stories. And this is why the Grimes narrative is so important, because he tells an unfiltered story, one that did not involve white involvement. So it's powerful. It needs to be read just as much as Douglas needs to be read, just as much as Jacobs needs to be read, because of its authenticity.
Well, I thank you so much, Regina Mason, for sharing this story, for doing the work and the research, for being persistent and persevering, and continuing to highlight incidents with William Andrews so that you got this new book reprinted. It's an important work. You're doing the work, and I commend you for doing this, and look forward to seeing the film version. You're doing a documentary on this, I believe, right?
Yes, that is correct, and we hope 2014 will be our year. It's been a long time in the making, but we are persevering, just as William Grimes did, to get his story told.
Right. It's important to remember that,
Yes, it is.
Yes.
And I want to say one last thing to your listeners. I want to really press this point. If you do not have a family historian, become one. Our stories are so important to tell, and our stories are life-changing. Our personal journeys are life-changing. So I always tell that to anyone that I'm speaking to, that it's so important to reclaim our history.
Well, that's a wonderful way to complete this interview. I want to thank you again. I want our listeners to remember the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing, and go out and purchase The Life of William Grimes, The Runaway Slave, edited by William Andrews and Regina Mason. Make sure that this book is in your home. Make sure that this book gets into your schools. Make sure that this book gets into the curriculum. We have to change the way our history is told. And this has been Brenda Greene, the host of Writers on Writing. Please write me at writers@mec.cuny.edu, and come back next week.
Next song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes.